The morning began like any other at Lake Ranch, a sprawling community tucked between a shimmering blue lake and a dense forest line that framed the eastern horizon. The air carried the scent of pine and fresh water, a reminder of the tranquility this place was supposed to offer. But for me, peace had been replaced with a constant undercurrent of tension ever since the HOA board decided they wanted complete control over the lakefront office. The Lake Ranch office wasn't just a building. It was the operational hub for everything that kept the community running: maintenance, scheduling, boat slip permits, fishing licenses, and even property dispute mediation. My name wasn't on any HOA roster, but my company held a master contract for managing the entire property. For years, we had worked in tandem with the HOA, but recently, new leadership had taken over. A leadership led by a woman everyone whispered about, but no one dared confront directly. Her name was Patricia Holcomb. To the residents, she was Patty. To me, she was simply Karen incarnate. Patricia had decided, without warning or vote, that the Lake Ranch office should be hers to control. No outside contractors, no independent oversight. She wanted the building, the operations, and the authority. And she wanted me gone. The problem was that she didn't have the legal right to enforce any of that. My contract was solid. The county backed my operational authority, and even the sheriff's department knew I was within my rights. It started with little jabs. Residents would show up claiming their appointments had been reassigned by the HOA, despite being on my calendar. Deliveries I had scheduled mysteriously failed to arrive. And just 2 days before this incident, someone from the HOA filed a complaint with the fire marshal claiming the office had blocked emergency exits. That complaint was dismissed immediately, but it told me one thing. Patricia wasn't just playing politics. She was gearing up for war. That morning, I arrived early, hoping to get ahead of the inevitable chaos. The lake glistened under the first touches of sunlight, and I could hear ducks paddling near the docks. But as soon as I stepped into the office, I noticed something was off. My desk had been moved. Papers were scattered across the floor. The back door, which was always locked, stood slightly ajar. And sitting behind the front counter, in my chair, was Patricia herself. She wore a crisp, overpriced blazer and a smirk that made it clear she thought she'd won. Without a word, I walked to my side of the desk, picked up my office keys, and started putting my paperwork back in order. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't engage. I knew what she wanted. An argument, a scene, something she could twist into a violation of the community harmony clause the HOA loved to throw around. But Patricia wasn't going to let my silence ruin her plans. She stood, blocking my access to the computer, and in her sharpest tone, told me that the HOA had officially terminated my occupancy of this office. She handed me a printed notice on HOA letterhead, signed only by herself. No board vote, no legal grounding, just her signature, as though she were a queen declaring an edict. I read it once, set it down, and continued working. My contract, signed by the property owner, not the HOA, was clear. The HOA had no authority to terminate my position or remove me from the office. I wasn't about to pack up and leave just because Patricia said so. That's when she pulled out her phone. She turned slightly so I could see the bright 911 on her screen before pressing the call button. She announced, loudly enough for the security camera to catch every word, that there was an unauthorized trespasser refusing to vacate private property and that she felt unsafe. Within minutes, I could hear sirens echoing across the lake. They grew louder, closer, until 2 police cruisers pulled into the gravel lot outside. Doors opened. Footsteps crunched. Patricia straightened her blazer and crossed her arms, certain that the cavalry had arrived to escort me away. 2 officers stepped inside. They were polite but direct, asking for my name and identification. I provided both without hesitation, then handed them a laminated copy of my operational contract. One officer took it to read, while the other stepped aside to radio dispatch. Patricia kept talking over everyone, peppering her speech with words like dangerous and threat, as though she were auditioning for a crime documentary. Then something happened that wiped the smirk off her face. The officer who had been speaking into his radio suddenly glanced at me, then turned his attention fully away from Patricia. He asked me a simple question. "You're the John from Lakeshore Management?" I nodded. His entire demeanor shifted. He lowered his voice, stepped outside and made another call, this time not on the police radio, but on his personal phone. I watched from the window as he spoke, nodded, and then handed the phone to the other officer. Patricia noticed the change, too. Her expression hardened, her posture stiffened. Whatever she expected to happen wasn't going according to plan. A minute later, the second officer walked back inside and handed me the phone. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, and instantly familiar. It was the county's 911 dispatch chief. He didn't ask me what was going on. He simply said, "Hold your ground. They're just there to make sure you're safe." Patricia must have overheard because she erupted in protest, demanding to know why I wasn't being removed. But the officers had already made up their minds. They asked her to step outside while they sorted the matter. And that was when I realized Patricia thought she could weaponize the system against me. What she didn't know was that I was a system, at least in part. My company didn't just manage the property. We provided direct logistical support for emergency services across the county. The very people she had called to remove me, they answered to the same operational chain I belonged to. Still, the day wasn't over. Patricia wasn't the type to admit defeat, and as she paced outside the office, speaking furiously into her phone, I knew this was just the first round. Hand with finger splayed. The officers left without incident, but the silence that followed was deceptive. Patricia didn't storm off in defeat. She lingered just beyond a gravel lot, pacing like a predator, deciding whether to attack head-on or circle around for a better angle. I could see her gesturing wildly into her phone, her voice sharp enough to cut through the glass of the office windows. She wasn't gone for more than 10 minutes before a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside her. Out stepped two more HOA board members, both dressed like they had just stepped out of a country club luncheon. They didn't even glance at me through the window. Their focus was entirely on Patricia, who stood at the center of their huddle, speaking with the kind of energy that only comes from knowing you've been publicly embarrassed. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over. HOA politics, especially under Patricia's rule, were never about compromise. They were about control. And I had just humiliated their president in front of local law enforcement. But Patricia wasn't relying on legality. She was relying on harassment. Over the next 48 hours, a parade of official notices, each more ridiculous than the last, arrived at my door. One cited unauthorized use of community electricity because I'd plugged in the office coffee maker. Another claimed my parked truck was an abandoned vehicle because it hadn't moved in 24 hours. When that didn't work, she escalated to the residents. HOA-friendly neighbors began showing up with complaints about noise and suspicious activity at the office. Often at times, I wasn't even there. It became clear that Patricia was mobilizing her supporters to create a paper trail of problems she could wave in front of anyone who might listen. Still, the most telling move came late in the week. Early Friday morning, I arrived at the office to find the locks had been changed. The brass cylinder glinted in the sun, brand new and smug in its refusal to turn with my key. There was no note, no warning, just a new lock on a door I legally controlled. I called the property owner immediately. He was furious. Not only had Patricia overstepped her authority, she had technically committed an act that could be classified as a legal entry. He told me to sit tight while he handled it. Less than an hour later, a locksmith, paid for by the owner, was on site replacing the lock with one of my choosing. The HOA president's power play had failed again. By that afternoon, word had spread across the community. Some residents were openly amused by Patricia's antics, while others seemed genuinely confused about why the HOA was going to war over an office. I didn't go out of my way to explain. It wasn't my job to sway public opinion, but I could feel the tide shifting. Patricia's overreach was starting to draw more attention than she wanted. That's when she switched tactics again. On Saturday morning, as I was reviewing maintenance schedules, I noticed a group gathering outside the office. At first, I thought it was a protest, but as the crowd grew, I realized it was something worse. An impromptu community meeting organized entirely by Patricia and her allies. They had set up folding chairs on the lawn, a portable speaker system, and even a table with coffee and pastries, bribery disguised as hospitality. From my vantage point inside, I could hear bits of her speech. She spoke about outsiders taking control of community resources, and the importance of reclaiming what's ours. She didn't mention my name, but she didn't have to. Every pointed glance toward the office made it clear who the villain in her story was supposed to be. I stayed inside, watching, noting faces in the crowd. Some were diehard HOA loyalists, nodding along to every word. Others looked skeptical, arms crossed, eyes darting between Patricia and the office. And then there were a few who weren't even residents, likely friends she called in to pad the turnout and make it look like the community was united behind her. When the meeting broke up, the real damage became clear. Several attendees walked directly to the office door, trying to handle, peering to the windows, making a show of inspecting the premises. I recognized two of them as the same residents who had filed bogus noise complaints earlier in the week. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was becoming a coordinated harassment campaign. By Monday, the pressure reached a new level. An official letter arrived, this time on county letterhead. My heart sank until I read the first line and realized what it was: a formal notice of an emergency community safety audit. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Patricia had clearly pulled strings to get county inspectors involved, hoping they'd find some technical violation she could use against me. But this was where her plan unraveled. The lead inspector who showed up wasn't just familiar with my operations. He was a close professional contact. We'd worked together on safety upgrades for half a dozen properties in the area. He walked through the office, clipboard in hand, checking off boxes with practiced efficiency. At the end, he handed me the inspection form. No violations found. Patricia had been watching from across the lot. The moment she saw the inspector shake my hand and leave without a single citation, her face hardened. She turned abruptly, got into her SUV, and drove off without a word. I knew she wasn't finished. If anything, her failure to remove me through official channels meant she was going to get more creative and more desperate. That night, as I locked up the office, I noticed something unusual. A black sedan I didn't recognize was parked down the street, engine running, headlights off. When I stepped outside, the sedan pulled away slowly, disappearing around the bend toward the lake. Patricia's war wasn't just about paperwork anymore. She was moving into intimidation. Patricia's failed attempt at direct eviction had done more than frustrate her. They had bruised her ego. And for someone like her, public embarrassment was fuel for escalation. She abandoned small-scale harassment and set her sights on a much bigger stage, the county board meeting. 2 weeks later, I found myself listed as an agenda item under the heading Community Concerns. That in itself wasn't unusual. Property disputes popped up all the time, but the way Patricia framed it was. She claimed the Lake Ranch office was mismanaged by an outside contractor and operating in violation of community trust. It was pure theater, designed to make me look like a rogue operator in front of county officials. The meeting hall was crowded. HOA loyalists filled the front rows, dressed and coordinated, support the board. T-shirts like this was a campaign rally. Patricia took the podium with practiced poise, speaking as if she were delivering a closing argument in court. She waved photographs of the office, copies of fabricated violation notices, even staged pictures of blocked emergency exits that I recognized as having been taken before last year's renovations. But her biggest mistake was assuming the county board didn't know me. Over the years, I had worked hand in hand with their departments: roads, safety, environmental compliance. As she spoke, I could see the board members exchanging glances, their patience thinning. When it was my turn, I didn't match her theatrics. I presented my signed management contract, maintenance logs, and records of every inspection passed without issue. I didn't need to win the crowd. I only needed to remind the board of the facts. The decision was quick. The board reaffirmed my operational authority and reminded the HOA that they had no jurisdiction over the property's management office. Patricia's carefully staged performance crumbled in less than 10 minutes. As the crowd began to disperse, Patricia avoided eye contact, speaking in low, urgent tones to her allies. I could feel her anger from across the room. This wasn't the end. It was just another public loss she would try to erase. And as I left the hall, I noticed something unsettling: a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was a single line, printed in bold black letters: